Thank you for joining us. Shalom means peace, and ever since this show first went on the air, we hoped to see positive solutions implemented in all areas and for all people in the world, not only in the Middle East. While we see the maximum is being done to address the worldwide pandemic and economic crisis, there's also some really tremendous news. We just witnessed the most historic milestone since President Sadat of Egypt visited Israel in 1977 and made peace. He and Prime Minister Begin received the Nobel Peace Prize, which they unquestionably deserved and earned. Since then, throughout these years, we've seen both Democrat and Republican administrations trying to broker more peace in the Middle East, in addition to promises to move the US Embassy to Israel's capital, Jerusalem. They could have, but they never did. With all the lies and half-truths imposed upon us for decades, especially now at this time, everyone should have the honesty to recognize promises made and promises kept. Actions do speak louder than words, and whether people like President Trump or not, what has he actually done? Shouldn't one have the courage and integrity to recognize the true facts, whether some people like it or not? Donald Trump is the most pro-Israel US president since the Jewish state was founded in 1948. He recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and in fact did move the US Embassy there. He withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, which was a threat to world peace and of course the entire region. He formally recognized Israel's sovereignty over the strategic Golan Heights. And in December 2019, Trump signed a groundbreaking executive order to protect Jewish students across America to enforce Title VI against discrimination, including anti-Semitism. So no president in history has come close to being as dedicated and loyal a friend of the Jewish people and Israel as this president. Whether some people like him or not, we should face the truth. Speaker Newt Gingrich will share his thoughts on these historic achievements following these messages.
Flags! Carry! Flag!
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, accompanied by the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, His Highness, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates, and the Minister of the Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Bahrain.
We're here this afternoon to change the course of history. After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East. Thanks to the great courage of the leaders of these three countries, we take a major stride toward a future in which people of all faiths and backgrounds live together in peace and prosperity.
Our dear friend, President Trump, First Lady Melania Trump, thank you for hosting me, my wife Sarah, and our entire delegation on this historic day. I want to recognize Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, National Security Advisor O'Brien, and other cabinet members, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, Ambassador Friedman, and other members of the President's able peace team, senators, members of Congress, Israeli Ambassador Ron Dermer, his Emirate and Bahraini counterparts, as well as all the dignitaries gathered here. This day is a pivot of history. It heralds a new dawn of peace. And this is why today we're filled with such profound gratitude. I am grateful to you, President Trump, for your decisive leadership. You have unequivocally stood by Israel's side. I am grateful to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates and to you, Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed, in bringing hope to all the children of Abraham. To all of Israel's friends in the Middle East, those who are with us today and those who will join us tomorrow, I say, Assalamu alaikum. Peace unto thee. Shalom. the blessings of the peace we make today will be enormous. And ultimately, it can end the Arab-Israeli conflict once and for all.
With us now is Speaker Newt Gingrich. Sir, it's a real privilege and honor to have you back on the show.
Glad to be back with you.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask you, what is so special and unique and important about this current election?
Well, I think in terms of the United States and the world, and in terms of the definition of the United States, this is the biggest choice since Abraham Lincoln in 1864. The fact is that the gap between the kind of strong leadership that President Trump has brought and the kind of very weak leadership, which you certainly got with the Obama-Biden team. Remember, they were sending billions of dollars to prop up the Iranian dictatorship while Trump was killing Soleimani, the leading terrorist and head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They were dithering about doing nothing, and Trump destroyed ISIS and killed al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. So there's a huge difference in the approach. The president had the courage to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. It's a bill that I actually authored when I was the Speaker of the House, had a provision that each president could waive it. And from 1995 on, the State Department convinced every president to waive it until they got to Donald Trump. And he said, no, why should Israel be the only country in the world that is not allowed to define its own capital? So because he had gone to Riyadh for his very first overseas trip, and the King of Saudi Arabia had assembled 54 Muslim countries, the largest group ever to gather with an American president, he spent 3 days with them. That created a framework where he could move the embassy. There was no problem. Everything we'd been warned about didn't happen. After that, as they realized that he would be tough in defending them from Iran, that he would keep his word, you then had the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain both recognizing Israel in the first big breakthrough of its kind in 25 years. So you take all of that and you look at the weakness, the appeasement, the confusion that a Biden administration would have. And I think it's pretty clear which of the two is a safer bet if you're interested in peace and security and a better, frankly, better world, not just better Middle East.
Some people make choices based on personalities rather than their actual actions. And many people are really concerned over the fact that your colleague Pelosi actually belittled this historic event, calling it a mere distraction. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I think Pelosi is a San Francisco radical, just as Kamala Harris is a San Francisco radical. I think there's a deep streak of anti-Semitism in the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think that nothing Donald Trump can do could be seen as positive. You know, if Trump next Tuesday managed to get the Chinese communists to give up and create democracy in China, Nancy Pelosi would find some reason to belittle it and say it wasn't a big deal. That's just the nature of where we are as a country. You have a very radical leader in the House who deeply, deeply dislikes the president and won't give him credit for anything.
This worldwide pandemic and economic crisis is hurting the entire world, and probably more so in other countries by far than here in the United States. And is it not ridiculous to have this politicization and blame game occurring?
Well, look, I think it's unfortunate. And one of the problems we have is what Trump did, cutting taxes, cutting regulations, encouraging businesses, praising people who are entrepreneurs, getting better trade agreements. All of those things came together. And by February of this year, we had the strongest American economy in history, the lowest Black unemployment, the lowest Latino unemployment. We actually had a dramatic drop in the number of people living in poverty, and things were going very well. The challenge of, say, most of Europe is they can't adopt these policies. Their interest groups, their trade unions, their bureaucracies, all those things block them from the kind of entrepreneurial, growth-oriented policies that are allowing America right now. We're coming back out of this mess very rapidly. And I think very likely by the middle of next year, we'll be pulling away from virtually every other country on the planet because if Trump gets reelected, because our entrepreneurial spirits, our drive to create things, our willingness to have people be successful is so much greater than in most countries. And as a result, we attract many of the most creative people from every country in the world. So I think it's kind of difficult for the countries that have bad policy, but it's terrific for the US.
Regardless of personalities, who is better for peace in the Middle East in the future and better for Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, I think if you went all the way back to Ben Gurion, you would find that strength was the key to the survival of Israel, not weakness. That being prepared to defend yourself was the key to survival, not appeasement. And that when you're living next to leaders of Hamas who say publicly in the New York Times, not a single Jew will remain, that's probably pretty difficult to see what you're going to negotiate. So I think having a tough American leader, and look, there's no question there are times, 10% less Trump would be 100% more effective. There's no question that at times he's irritating. There's no question at times that he's rough around the edges. On the other hand, if you need somebody who's strong, capable of standing up to Xi Jinping in China or Putin in Russia, or capable of standing up to Syria or Turkey, where we now have a growing problem, sadly, I think when you look at all that, Trump is dramatically better. And Biden would just be, you can't have a bunny rabbit who hides in the basement trying to develop things in the Middle East. And everything we've seen out of Biden this year has been a bunny rabbit. He hasn't been a great, courageous leader out there doing things. He's been hiding. You can't hide your way to security.
So you've been compared to Winston Churchill and are regarded as one of the bright leaders of this country. And there are some other individuals around who require teleprompters and coaching constantly, and some others who are off the cuff. What is the significance of all of this?
I don't know. I think it's partly that, and Trump and I, in that sense, are very similar, as was Reagan. I mean, if you know what you believe, and if you read and study and listen to people constantly, you don't need much of a teleprompter. You don't need much coaching. Now, the truth is, Trump gives a lot of speeches off of teleprompter. I would do the same if I were in his shoes, because you can't do as many different speeches as he did and do them all just off the cuff. You'll sort of forget which points you're trying to make. You won't know if you made it at the last stop or where you're at. So I think in that sense, there's nothing wrong with using a teleprompter. The bigger difference is in staffing, and this is why you have a very large Never Trump group in the National Security Group. They are very angry at Trump for three reasons. One is his style, which they think is not adequately sophisticated. He doesn't behave like he went to Yale or Harvard, although he did go to Wharton and has a pretty good background in that sense. Second is that he doesn't need them. And I think it drives them crazy because, they spend their whole life getting to be experts on something, and they want to have a president that they can get to go brief. Well, he doesn't need briefings from them. And if he wants to learn about Saudi Arabia, he picks up the phone and calls the king. If he wants to know about Israel, he picks up the phone and calls Netanyahu or Gantz. But he doesn't, he doesn't sit around and wait for some guy to walk in and give him a briefing. The third thing that drives him crazy, I think, is he represents a genuine change. He came to office believing that after 19 years, we were not winning in Afghanistan. We were not going to win in Afghanistan. And he wanted, frankly, to cut our losses, shift our focus to China, not lose Americans to no good long-term advantage. And he was prepared to be very tough in the Middle East. And moving the embassy violated everything that the old establishment believed in. Working out a deal with United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain was the opposite. All of those people would have bet you could never do it. So he humiliates them by being right where they were wrong. he emasculates them by not needing their advice, and he infuriates them by his style.
One of the great revelations, I think, of this year is the fact that mass media has really such an immense effect on public opinion, influencing people with social media, the big tech companies. I had no idea it was as bad as it's now revealed to be. What are your thoughts on that?
I think when you learn that Facebook has an office in Seattle with 12 Chinese communists who are designing their censorship program, literally 12 people from communist China are designing the Facebook censorship program, you know all you need to know. We're going to have to radically change the rules for companies the size of Twitter, Google, and Facebook, because you can't have a private monopoly that can capriciously decide who it wants to back and who it wants to destroy. And I think the decision by Twitter to cut off the New York Post, which is the oldest newspaper in the US and the fourth biggest, was such an enormous mistake that they will rue the day they did it, and it will inevitably lead to dramatic reform.
Lies by omission, I think many people don't even understand what that means. Please elaborate a little more on the significance of misleading and lying by omission.
Well, I think, look, we have a real scandal building about the Biden family, their corruption, their ties to Russia, Ukraine, and China. And you have these large institutions, whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, or Twitter and Facebook, desperately trying to block the news from reaching the average American. Now, they're gradually, steadily losing ground, but they are desperate to block this news from getting out there. And I think as a result, they actually attracted more attention to the story by the way they have behaved and convinced more people that there's something real there. But I think that whenever they can, you won't find anything positive about Trump. You'll find only negative things about Trump. And the astonishing thing is, after 5 years of this treatment, he's still standing there. And in fact, my bet is he's going to win the presidency again. And they're all going to be in a state of shock, requiring him to go to psychologists and have some kind of therapy session.
What will happen in this great nation if the Democrats win?
It'll be a total disaster. We've seen it in California. We've seen it in New York. We've seen it in Illinois. The first thing they would try to do is change the rules so they couldn't be challenged for 30 or 40 years. The second thing they would do is codify very left-wing anti-American values, both in schools, in the news media, in the bureaucracy. And you would literally be living in a country that was changed from America into some kind of left-wing authoritarian state. I think this is literally the most important election since 1864. And I am very worried about it because the stakes are so great. I think Trump will win, but the stakes are really that big.
People compare this socialist dream to what occurs and is occurring in Venezuela. Please share with our audience your thoughts on that.
Socialism has never worked because the underlying principles don't work. The idea that you don't have to do anything and I'll take care of you doesn't work very long. As Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher once said, the challenge of socialism is you run out of other people's money to spend. Cuba, Venezuela, the old Soviet Union, those systems don't work, period. And in fact, Denmark tried socialism. It was such a disaster, they gave it up. And the Danes get very upset when people like Bernie Sanders describes himself as a Danish socialist, because they aren't socialists. They're capitalists with a big welfare system, but they're not socialists. And I think in that sense, the state running everything is a disaster. And every time it's tried, it fails. And it always leads to shrinking human freedom and leaving people with more constrained lives.
So back to the pandemic. This is no one's fault, not in the United States, certainly. Yet there's this blame game going on. Do you believe that with misinformation and masks one moment, and then in the very beginning we were told not to bother with them, and all of this blame game, do you believe that either side could do better than the other with regard to this horrific situation of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, we have pretty solid evidence. If you go back and look at how Vice President Biden and President Obama dealt with the swine flu early in their administration. It was a total disaster. One of Biden's aides has said, we did everything wrong. We were just very lucky that it turned out not to be very fatal. 60 million Americans got the swine flu. So I think you can start and say we know how bad they'd have been. And if you look at the actual steps, President Trump moves very early to cut off travel from China. Biden's attacking him. Pelosi's attacking him. President Trump moves to cut off travel from Europe. He gets attacked again. He rapidly starts expanding American production because the Obama-Biden administration had failed to replenish all of the various masks and ventilators that they'd used during the swine flu. So within a matter of months, as an entrepreneur, President Trump had recruited a huge number of corporations. We are now the world's leading supplier of ventilators and other personal health equipment. And we're shipping it all over the world now. So I think it's fair to say that they originally thought we would lose over 2,200,000 people. And I think President Trump saved almost 2 million lives by the energy and the drive and the willingness to make tough decisions, even though people like Biden were opposed to it.
So what are your thoughts with regard to the very extensive contradictions? People saying racist things, flip-flopping entirely, all of a sudden a decade later saying something completely different, flip-flopping on fracking and other. What is the significance of these contradictions?
Well, the reason that they have to be contradictory is their left is so isolated from the rest of the country that if you want to become a Democratic nominee, you have to tell the left things which you can't possibly tell the rest of the country. So while you're campaigning in the primary, you pose as though you're going to do all these things that the left loves and the country hates. For example, packing the court, more than 2-to-1 Americans don't want to pack the court. The idea of abolishing fracking, trying to close out fossil fuels, getting us to, $20 or $30 a gallon gasoline. I mean, when people start listening to that stuff, they think it's crazy. So people like Biden and Kamala Harris have to go to the left in order to get the nomination and then have to scurry back to the center in order to try to win the general election. And that's why you see this kind of contradiction.
So you've written quite a few books over the years, and currently, tell us about the book you've just released.
Well, I have 2 books recently that I'm very proud of. One is called Trump versus China, which is, I think, a very solid work on why we are facing such a huge challenge from Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist dictatorship. The other, which just came out, is on Trump and the American future, and really is an effort to lay out solving the great problems of our time and giving people a handbook if they want to talk with their neighbors about whether the issue of crime and police or the issue of education or the issue of healthcare. And I'm very proud of Trump and the American future, and I think it's a very useful book in this kind of a political environment.
Before we conclude, I must ask you, if the Democrats win, do you believe there'll be more riots? And on the other hand, what do you see a future if the president is re-elected?
Well, in the short run, I think there'll be a lot of disturbance if the president gets re-elected because the left will go crazy. In the long run, what we saw, for example, in Portland, Oregon, where you've had over 100 days of demonstrations with a very left-wing mayor, is that strength matters. I mean, if the Biden administration comes in and tries to appease Antifa and tries to appease Black Lives Matter, you'll just have looting and rioting and intimidation all over the country. If Trump continues in office, as he's already proven, we've already arrested over 2,500 people, he will methodically arrest all the people who are the real threats. And presently things will calm down because they'll all be in jail.
To conclude, for our audience, what message would you share with our audience as we conclude this interview today?
The United States is the most extraordinary society in history. We truly believe that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We've offered more freedom, more prosperity, and more safety to people from every country on the planet. And I think we're in great struggle, as Lincoln said, to decide whether this system can in fact continue. And I hope all of you, everybody who sees this, will decide that preserving America is worth voting, it's worth getting involved, it's worth talking to your neighbors, because that's what it takes in a free society. We have to win the argument, and then we'll win the vote.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so very much for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
We know that in solving the many, many problems and our great challenges, faith is more powerful than government, and nothing is more powerful than God. Since the signing of the Declaration of Independence 241 years ago, America always affirmed that liberty comes from our Creator. Our rights are given to us by God, and no earthly force can ever take those rights away. Our religious liberty is enshrined in the very First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. The American founders invoked our Creator 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Franklin reminded his colleagues at the Constitutional Convention to begin by bowing their heads in prayer. Faith has forged the identity and the destiny of this great nation that we all love. Our nation will be renewed by hard work, a lot of intelligence, and prayer. We don't want to see God forced out of the public square, driven out of our schools, or pushed out of our civic life. We want all children to have the opportunity to know the blessings of God. Prayer changes hearts, transforms lives. It uplifts the soul, inspires action, and unites us all. We thank God for the faith of our people. We praise God for the blessings of freedom. And whether we are black or brown or white, and you've heard me say this before, we all bleed the same red blood. We all salute the same great American flag. And we are all made by the same Almighty God. We ask God to forever bless this magnificent land that we all love so much, America. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless the United States. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
This concludes our special show for today with Newt Gingrich from On Location in South Florida. I'm Richard Peretz. Thank you for being with us.